Hello, I'm David Tunick, president of the IFPDA, and I'm here to welcome you to a program that's part of our annual print month, which I will add coincides with the IFPDA online print fair. Today's presentation is the fourth during print month devoted to the extraordinary artists of the Grosvenor School. Over the course of the last 3 weeks, many of you will have attended one or more of the sessions brought to you by the Metropolitan Museum and the IFPDA in the form of a symposium on the Grosvenor School linoleum cut printmakers. So today will be a special pleasure for everyone to hear from three of the most prominent authorities in the world on the Grosvenor School as they discuss the relationship between two of the most prominent artists in the Grosvenor School. Those two artists are, of course, Sybil Andrews and Cyril Power, who came together in a relationship in the early 1920s when she was single and 24 years old, and he was married and 50 years old. The expert authorities presenting today are my old friend and esteemed colleague, Gordon Samuel, coming to us from London. Next to him will be prize-winning English critic and author Jenny Uglow, who has written a book entitled Sybil and Andrews, Cutting Through Time. Our leader today will once again be the brilliant Jennifer Farrell, curator of modern and contemporary prints and illustrated books at the Metropolitan Museum. We're going to spend a few minutes now just at the start asking Jennifer a few questions. So Jennifer, if you would come on screen, please.
Hi, David. Thank you for the gracious introduction.
Hi, Jennifer. Great to have you back again. Thank you for your multiple appearances this month. The Grosvenor School artists were barely known to the art public before the 1980s or even 1990s. Can you tell us in a brief word how and when you came to admire and study the Grosvenor School artists?
Sure. I think really my first substantial exposure to the Grosvenor School artist was when I visited Leslie Garfield. He and his wife, Jo, had an incredible collection of Grosvenor work. I was researching works for the World War I and the Visual Arts show, which we held at the Met in 2017. So about the year before, I would go to visit and look at his vast holdings in that area, which is also part of the Garfield acquisition. So it's now at the Met, but I was looking at Nevinson and Wadsworth and many other, Kennington, many other figures. And of course, you can't help but notice the Grosvenor work, which is absolutely extraordinary and deeply powerful, and the colors and the texture visible in his works are just incredible.
And when was that? Maybe I missed it, but did you say around?
I think it was 2016. It was in advance of the World War I and the Visual Arts, which opened in summer 2017.
Well, you got on it very quickly because tomorrow night, the Metropolitan Museum opens the big exhibition that you have curated entitled Modern Times British Prints, 1913, 1939. It opens to the public on Friday, which is earlier than it says on the website.
We're really fast.
All of you out there may be aware of that.
We're really fast at installation. So.
Well, what about the installation of the idea for the exhibition in your mind? What was the genesis, and how many works are there in the exhibition by today's subjects, Sybil and Cyril?
Oh, well, that's a pop quiz. I don't know that one. The breakdown, but the genesis for the exhibition and the related publication, beyond just an interest, but is that we recently acquired the Garfield collection of British modernist prints that was acquired in 2019. So in the fall and winter of 2019. So that was incredibly exciting, and with this really a broad range of material that Les and Joe built, as he spoke about on the call the other day, the Zoom call. It's not only the prints, but it's sketchbooks, it's working sketches, it's color proofs, it's blocks from flight, it's copies of their publications, sometimes they're scrapbooks. And it provides so much insight into these artists. And there are just so many ways to approach them, from their working method of the color linocut. And that's part of the show. We're starting with Wadsworth and the woodcuts. But then also just the moment that they worked, which is a question that has long been something I've been pondering, which is, how art creates, or artists create an appropriate, or what they deem an appropriate visual language, especially in moments of great trauma and very tumultuous decades, which of course this was, bracketed by 2 world wars. It was another pandemic. And it was also, of course, the Great Depression, or as they called it in Britain, the slump, and the rise of fascism. So there was, what language, what's the appropriate response of artists at that, do they deem? And the embrace of printmaking as a response, the resolutely handmade work of kind of machine age subjects, and or at least applying that aesthetic to even things such as a steeplechase. And one thing we've been struck with is just also the rise of consumer culture, the role of the BBC, the movies, radio, what this means. So in some ways, it reminds me very much of some of the issues in post-war Europe too, such as dealt with the situationist. So I don't want to cut into Jenny and Gordon's time, but that was, I think, really to give an in-depth look at the moment that they worked, as well as their artwork, as well as their methods for production.
Right, and maybe we'll hear from Jenny Uglow and from Gordon what connection the mood of the Roaring Twenties may have fed into the relationship between the two artists. If anybody in the audience has any questions at any time, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens and type them in. We'll get to as many as we can at the end. There were almost 200 people registered for this, so as usual, we'll ask you to understand if we cannot get to your question. And Jennifer, go ahead and please take over the floor and introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you again to Jenny and Sherry of IFPDA for making everything possible. It's really often involving different time zones and continents, and they make it seamless. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers today, Gordon Samuel and Jenny Uglow, because they really, we get the unique experience of almost being able to eavesdrop on what should be a fascinating conversation in advance of Jenny's book, Sybil and Cyril, Cutting Through Time. Jenny Uglow is a former editorial director of Chateau and Windus, and is the author of prize-winning biographies and cultural histories. Her books include studies of George Eliot and Henry Fielding, and a life of Elizabeth Gaskell, as well as The Lunar Men, The Friends Who Made the Future of 2002, A Gambling Man, Charles II and the Restoration of 2009, The Pine Cone, The Story of Sarah Losh of 2012, In These Times, Living in Britain Through Napoleon's Wars, 1793 to 1815 of 2014. She is particularly interested in the relation of text and image, something she explored in the short Words and Pictures, Writers, Artists, and a peculiarly British tradition of 2018, and in her biographies of Hogarth, Buick, and Walter Crane. Her most recent book is Mr. Lear, A Life of Art and Nonsense, that was the winner of the Hawthornden Prize in 2018. Her most recent book, the reason for this incredible opportunity to hear her speak, is Sybil and Cyril, Cutting Through Time, which will be published in the UK by Faber in November 2021, which is Monday, hopefully, and by Farrar Straus in the spring of 2022, which means they'll be available in the United States next year. She was created in OBE in 2008 and was chair of the Royal Society of Literature 2014 to 2016. And joining Jenny will be Gordon Samuel. Gordon Samuel co-founded the Osborne Samuel Gallery in 2004 with Peter Osborne. Previously, he directed the gallery Samuel and Company and was director of Redfern and the Mercury Gallery. Osborne Samuel is one of London's leading specialists in modern British painting and sculpture and is well known for its exhibitions of post-war British painters and sculptors, including Henry Moore, whose work is on view now. The gallery also specializes in rare 20th century prints, including the linocuts of the Grosvenor School. Recently, they have shown the complete prints of Nevinson, Power, and Andrews. In 2019, Gordon curated Cutting Edge, Modernist British Printmaking, the most extensive museum exhibition of British modernist prints at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London. And it's a fantastic catalog that has been through numerous printings. Gordon can tell you more. And in addition, we are announcing that Gordon is having an exhibition opening November 18th, will be Sybil and Cyril Cutting Through Time, which will be on view through December. So with that, I ask you to please welcome Gordon and Jenny.
Well, good evening, everybody. Sorry about that slight pause. Welcome, and next to me is Jenny, and we're here in London at the Osborne Samuel Gallery. A very special occasion, so I wore a very, very special tie, which you might like to see. And you can see it's the 8 by Cyril Power, bought no less from the Metropolitan Museum in 2008, when there was a touring exhibition that went from Boston to the Met and then to the Wilsonian in Miami Beach. Anyway.
Well, it's a very stylish tie. It's lovely to be here. Yeah.
Good. Well, welcome. So really, my first question is, what attracted you to the subject of Cyril and Sybil? What brought it about?
Yes, well, it's really a very personal book in that my father rowed in the college age at Oxford. And when he got married, his best man, who had rowed in the same boat, bought him 2 prints. And they were Cyril the 8 and Sybil Andrews bringing in the boat, you know, wonderful. So I've actually lived with these prints all my life. And the way that you take up, that you love the pictures on the wall, but you don't take them sort of seriously if you're a child. And just recently, I was so moved by the rhythm and the style and the power, and I wanted to find out more about the artist. So that's how it began, really. But also, as Jennifer kindly said, I've written about Hogarth and Buick and Walter Crane, and most recently Edward Lear. So that's, as it were, copper engraving and wood engraving and lithographs. And so it's very fascinating to find out about linocuts too. So the two came together.
Yeah. And I mean, the research is incredible, because I thoroughly enjoyed the book.
Oh,
I mean, it was absolutely wonderful. I read it when I was on holiday. But I mean, we've got the sketchbooks here, which you saw. And then if we can go on to the next slide, yeah, there they are.
Yeah.
You deciphered 52 sketchbooks of Cyril Power.
Yeah.
You then flew to Canada and you went to the Glenbow Museum and you did your research there. I mean, how on earth do you decipher these? I mean, I find it difficult to read the writing.
Oh, I think you get used to people's writing, and it's great fun. It was wonderful coming into the gallery here with this box of sketchbooks, which were not quite numbered in the right order, you know. So you look and you go through it and you find things like this lovely sketch of the vaults in Westminster Cathedral, which is actually dated. You think, oh, fantastic, I know they were there then. And Sybil and Cyril, I think, threw away all their letters or burnt them or destroyed them or chose not to leave them. So you don't have that kind of narrative, but you get a narrative from the sketchbooks and from these workbooks. This is Sybil Andrews' workbook. And if you can see it closely, what they did was each time they made a print, they had a page for it. and they described what blocks they used and who it was sold to and what edition it was. And they worked together. So Sybil has her print on the left-hand side, as it were, and then it's Cyril's Divertissement, about, as it were, dancers on the other side. And over time, Sybil kept these very, very carefully until her old age. So when she knew that a print had been resold, she went over it in biro and things like that. So you feel very, very close to their lives. And there's a wonderful archive in the Glenbow Museum in Calgary of all Sybil stuff. So over time, the picture composed itself. It was like a jigsaw.
I was going to say, you're like a sleuth.
Yeah. Yes, you are a sleuth.
Yeah. So, so Sybil grew up in this market town, Bury St Edmunds, and Cyril moved there with his family from London. And we can talk a little about their lives in Bury St Edmunds, their early lives, which is the late teens and early 20s. And for our overseas listeners, Bury St Edmunds is an ancient market town. It's in the county of Suffolk, and it's about 85 miles northeast of London.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So if we can just a little bit about their background in Bury and maybe even how they met.
Well, it's very interesting. Cyril was an architect, and after the war, he came to Bury to live because his wife's family came from there, the nuns. Yes, and they had come from farming stock, and the father was a corn merchant, so they're part of that Bury St Edmunds society. And Bury was a market town, as you said, but it also has an ancient cathedral, so it has a very grand tradition. Sybil's family had lived there for generations, and her father's family owned a large ironmonger's in the center of the town, and her grandfather actually became mayor, I think, 3 times. So they're very much part of that society. But her mother's family were antiquarians. Her grandfather was an archaeologist, and her mother followed and kept his papers. So there's an interest in the history as well. And really, Bury is so small that they were bound to meet. I mean, the story is that Sybil wanted to draw. Cyril saw her in the street, and later she did say, he used to sit me down in front of the most difficult buildings and just say, get on with it. Get on with it. And this is the kind of watercolors that they did together. That is actually a watercolor of Sybil's old house in Bury St Edmunds. But Cyril also taught her to etch, and that's what she said was her bread and butter. Yeah. So the etchings of historic buildings were really how they made a living for a time. And this is Cyril's slightly more
quite traditional, aren't they? I mean,
they're very traditional.
There's nothing modernist about them at this particular stage. That comes much later.
Exactly. So they were making their money in a very traditional way.
Yeah. So we can go on to the next one. Now here, I put this Nevinson print on the left-hand side, and the portrait of Cyril in the Royal Air Corps on the right-hand side. But on the left is Nevinson's lithograph of welders from Britain's efforts and ideals. And I put that in because this is what Sybil did during the war. She because of her background and business of the family being ironmongers, she was quite adept at lathe and metalwork, and so I thought it was a good idea to show that.
Oh, it's lovely to see it. And for 2 reasons, Sybil was only 16 when the First World War broke out. But she decided she wanted to be a welder, trained in London, and then worked in Coventry and in Bristol on the first, as it were, metal, fighters, welding. And it's particularly nice to have the Nevinson too, because they greatly admired Nevinson. They thought that he showed actually the brutality of war. And her time there was very important to her. Meanwhile, Cyril was looking after aircraft. So quite a lot of the aircraft that Sybil worked on would have gone to the airfields where
in Lymph in
Kent, where Cyril was. But also when Sybil was working with it at welding, she was at one day, she was sent to the sort of main room where the men were working, because the women only had, don't you can see from that print, small blowtorches. But somebody wanted to take her to have a large blowtorch. And if I just read what she said, she always remembered it, because if you see the next slide, yeah, you'll see how it comes into her work. And this is her great love of the sort of rhythm and the power and the strength of manual labor with the giant cable, but also on sledgehammers. You see the men beating the anvil in the middle. And she said that one day she was asked to go into the main blacksmith's shop while she's welding. And she said there were 5 men waiting in the blacksmith shop with sledgehammers, the dark shop, just the glow from the furnace. They were stripped to the waist and heavily tattooed and made a wonderful picture, together with the rhythm, you see it there, of the sledge strikes, for me unforgettable. 1 stroke, 2 stroke, 3 stroke, 4 stroke, 5 stroke, crash, crash, and the sparks flying and the glow from the red hot metal. It was like something out of time, old time. So she never forgot that. And I think that's partly behind this enormous surging energy that goes through all her prints, derived in part from her work with machines during the war.
So they leave Bury in 1922, and Sybil was 24, and Cyril was about 50 years old. It must have been quite controversial. This older man and a young girl.
Oh, I don't think he thought of himself as an old man.
No, well, at 50, I guess not. Not.
But he'd been like a teacher to her. And yes, it was quite controversial. And certainly eyebrows were raised. And Cyril's wife, Dolly, did move with the family from Bury immediately afterwards. And what had happened is they worked together. They had been doing watercolors together. They had a watercolor exhibition in the winter of 1921, at exactly the point at which Cyril's 4th child was born. So his wife was left with, 3 growing up children and a baby. And then it was early 1922 that Sybil left to go and enroll in art school in London. And at the end of the year, he followed her and enrolled as well. So they were a duo, as it were, when they left. They were together in people's minds.
So they enroll, first of all, at Heatherley's, which is, you can see on the slide there at the bottom right-hand side. And then in 1925, the Grosvenor School opened.
Yes.
And Cyril and Sybil joined the Grosvenor Schools. Cyril as a lecturer in historical architecture, and Sybil as the school secretary. I mean, she was very good at administration. I think she worked in Daventry, didn't she? Just after the war as a secretary.
Yes, she was a secretary.
A great organizer. But there you see the Grosvenor School at the top was opened by this man called Ian McNabb, who was number 2 at Heathersley School of Art, and employs Cyril and employs Sybil, and off they go. And then they meet Claude Flight.
They do indeed, yes. I think the Grosvenor School felt extremely sort of liberated.
Yes,
it's wonderful reading the letters, because clearly the money going to come in to start, when they did the prospectus, would the students come? So they're there very much, that trio actually at the beginning. And McNabb is obviously a wonderful personality, easygoing teacher, whereas Heatherley's have been more dictatorial, and they had rooms for printing and everything. And so it gets going. And then, Ian McNabb employs Claude Flight to come and teach.
And extraordinarily, I mean, one thing to Flight, and you think, well, he's there every single day teaching lino cutting, but actually it was just a Tuesday afternoon between 4:30 and 6:30 that he taught. And then this whole movement that we now see, derives from that.
Yes.
I mean, it's quite extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. I mean, I think that, you know, his name was known because his wonderful speed with the London buses had been shown in 1922 at the 7 and 5. And so that's why when he came to give these seminars, and if you think Sybil was actually the secretary to the school, Cyril was a lecturer at the school. So it wasn't just the students who went, the whole, you know, school was involved as well.
And then we have another slide, I think, of the prospectus.
Well, I think yes. And it would be nice to see the Claude flight speed too, wouldn't it?
Well, these are, let's just have a look at these. These are, it becomes slightly more modernist from the traditional colleges and things that they did. I mean, you can see the one on the right, you can see the beginnings of what Cyril was doing in the underground later.
Yes, yes, you can.
Let's go on to the next one.
I think when they were doing their dry point etchings, they were very involved with the city, and you get that wonderful weight of the city upon them. The railway stations, the viaducts, the Cannon Street railway bridge, wonderful one of Sybil's. And here it shows how closely they worked together. There are several drawings of Cyril's of the street, which is down near the wharves, really, the dockyards called Pickle Herring Street, with all the buildings leaning and the walkways across and things like that. And it's a couple of, he was obviously fascinated by it. And then a couple of years later, I think that Sybil, because she was fascinated by the shapes, she turns it into this extraordinary, powerful dry point. And they're very good at animating things, because here it's like science fiction, isn't it? You feel that those buildings are going to move and crowd into you. And what we have to thinking about the mood of the period, as we
it's
said
like
before,
Metropolis, isn't it?
it is exactly like Fritz Lang Metropolis. And there's a wonderful early Hitchcock 2, The Lodger, where he runs in through the city at night. And so it does come together with a feeling about the city, that it's actually both beautiful in a strange way and threatening. And when they wrote, going back to thinking about Nevinson again, actually, together in 1924, which is when they're beginning to do this kind of work, they wrote a sort of manifesto called Aims of the Art of Today. I know Flight wrote The Art of Today a couple of years later, but their aims, they said they want to get at the essence below the real, and that you needed an art like Nevinson's mitrailleuse, actually of the machine gunner during the war, which actually reflected both the beauty and the brutality of modern life. So I think that's very much what they're doing in their etching, as well as in their later linocuts.
But the early traditional prints that we saw was from a need to live.
Yes.
I mean, they hadn't become,
they
were still Sybil and Cyril.
They
were. And then later they became Andrews and Power.
Yes.
And they became artists.
Exactly. Yes, I feel that very much, actually. It's quite interesting the way that you talk about them or write about them, writing a book, because intimately, and their friends all thought Sybil and Cyril. But then once they're on the wall, I think they have that dignity of being Andrews and being Power, and maybe not always a duo too.
Let's go on to the next slide. What have we got? Well,
Yes.
As you were saying, this is Claude Flight's Speed, which he did in 1922 when he was part of the 7 and 5 Society, of which Ben Nicholson kicked him out of later on.
Oh, he kicked nearly everybody out.
Kicked nearly everybody out because he wasn't abstract enough.
Exactly.
But this is the bus, a red bus going down Regent Street with the Nash buildings. They are Nash, aren't they? Lining it. So Flight began teaching at the Grosvenor School in 1926, one class a week on modern block printing, as I said, from 4:30 to 6:30, and that cost 3 guineas, which is £3.15 for a quarter. And I went to the internet and just to see how much that was, and it translated to something like £198 in today's
Oh,
money,
right.
and then $270 in today's money.
Yeah.
But he was trying to sell these prints at 3 guineas, 2 guineas, and he thought it was a very egalitarian method of printmaking, and that people could afford it. But 3 guineas was an awful lot of money.
Oh, yes,
at
it
that
certainly
time,
was.
wasn't it?
Yes, it certainly was. I'm afraid it wasn't going to reach the people that he thought.
No.
He said at one point, didn't he, that he thought this art would be in the reach of working men. It would be the same as the price of a pint of beer or their cinema ticket, or the price of a pint of beer at the time, I think, was 10 pence, less than a shilling. So it's our tiny, not even 5p, 2p now. Whereas a print, as you say, 3 guineas is going to be £100.
But he was introduced to the linocut. I mean, he saw it at an exhibition of the British Institute of Industrial Art.
Yeah.
And these were works that were exhibited by Franz Sisek and his students, and many of them were school children, works by school children. And so here was a completely new medium, which he takes and transforms into what we know today.
That's
was
true.
an extraordinary thing, you know, and it was looked down upon at that time as well, because, you know, etching was boomed at that time, and linocuts were looked down upon by collectors as a childish art.
Yes, I think they certainly were looked down upon. And actually the Frank Chisek, when Sybil Andrews was introduced by Flight to Chisek's work and children's work, and it was that boldness of line that she really liked. You know, good that it looks like children's art, you know, that's absolutely direct and on the paper. She said all those strong, bold lines, it's so exciting. There's a wonderful thing about Sybil Andrews is that her favorite words are exciting and fun.
Right, what do we have next on the?
I think we've got Brooklyn's.
Oh, I put two. This is Flight's most iconic print. It's called Brooklands, and Brooklands was a racing track, the first motor racing track in the world, and Brooklands was near Weybridge in Surrey. And the one on the right is the finished edition of 50, and the one on the left was one that I sold, and he had actually signed this going this way around, which is the right way around for the cars to go around the track. And I certainly forgot about this, but it is the most interesting of all of his prints. And I think I showed on Monday when I was talking that his painting
of the swimmer.
Was the only abstract work that relates in any way to these prints.
But I think that here you have something that, in particular, Cyril Power takes from Flight, which is this wonderful sense of rhythm as well as speed.
You can see that in Speed Trial, in the blue racing car.
Yes, he did I mean, Cyril Power did a magnificent picture of a speed trial of the great Donald Campbell's Bluebird. But it derives clearly from that sort of energy and harmony. It's rather wonderful seeing them together like that, actually, isn't it?
And Flight, I'll just go back a little bit. He was at Heathersley's in 1912. And I'm just trying to think back how this imagery came about. And Nevinson was also there in 1912, and Nevinson was espousing the like cleansing the world of libraries and get rid of all old masters and being very, very bombastic. There's no evidence that they met. Did you find that in any of your research, whether they actually met?
No, I didn't find that they met. I found that, you know, they were there at the same time, and I think that Flight certainly knew Nevinson's views, and that they were both interested in the Italian Futurists, and who in turn were fascinated by London. I mean, the Italian Futurists of 1912, 1930 were saying, you know, London is the city of the future. Look at the neon, look at the speeding buses, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah for speed. And Flight himself says at one point, everybody is in a hurry and everybody around you is rushing past you. We need to reflect this modern sense of speed. So whether it came from Nevinson, the futurist to Nevinson to Flight, I can't trace it.
I've never been able to trace it either, but they must have known each other. I mean, Heathersley's wasn't a huge school, and although Flight was, what, 31 at the time, and Nevinson was in his mid-20s, they must have known each other.
Yeah.
Okay, so then they actually, incidentally, the Brooklands was printed in 1929, which coincided with the first exhibition of British linocuts at the Redfern.
Yes.
Where Rex Nankerville comes into our lives. So here is Rex, who was a New Zealander, and he joined up in New Zealand and got shipped to England. I think he was underage at the time, and he was born Reginald Nankerville. Nankerville was a Cornish name. So when he gets off the boat in London, he's changed his name to Rex.
Yes, and I think it even when he, you know, Sybil and Cyril encounter him, he is calling himself Rex de Charonbach.
Totally made up.
You know.
Totally made up. I mean, I loved him dearly. He was a lovely man, and I knew him very well because I joined the Redfern in 1970, and he died actually on Jubilee Tuesday in 1977. But he was a very, very generous man.
I think
he was a bit of a rogue, and he didn't like paying artists.
No, that's quite true. But actually, they were fond of him because he was so enthusiastic. You know, he came round to their studio, he looked at the prints. You know, he picked it up. The whole group, he was very good at. And when there was a row, certainly between Nankerville and Flight about the payment to the artists, it was jolly slow. And Flight moved his artists, I think, to the Ward
Galleries in Baker Street.
Yes, and then Andrews and Power did stay with Nankerville at the Redfern.
And then they had their joint show in 1933.
They did, yes.
Oh, fascinating. Well, he then, I mean, he went on showing linocuts in various exhibitions called Colour Prints, I think, until towards the latter part of the 30s.
Yeah.
But the Ward Gallery carried on. So they settle into London life. And Sybil finally has a studio of her own at Phoenix Place, which is now near the very expensive Holland Park area of London.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And the rent was paid for by Beatrice, her mother, although Cyril shared the studio with her, but actually had different. He had digs elsewhere. Yes, elsewhere. It was a sort of, he certainly, you know, they could go. No, we went up together. Yeah.
So
now I think what we were looking at earlier, I mean, this is Lil Schudy. And can we go to the next one? There were other artists that came out of the Grosvenor School, and this is William Greengrass, and the previous one was Lil Schudy, who Flight was very, very friendly with. Is there any? Did you uncover any link between Schudy and Andrews and Power? Did they know each other? Were they there at the same time?
They were there at the same time. And they overlapped in the exhibitions because Lil Schudy went to Paris very quickly. And certainly, I think the Australians were there at the same time. They don't occur much in Sybil's diary. She kept very matter of fact sort of appointment diaries, but she does mention who she's seeing. But in her old age in Canada, I think it was a Parkin gallery. Michael Parkin tracked down Lil Schudy and told Sybil, and she was very touched, and you know, they were touched to be put in touch with each other in their old age.
We're looking at two Australian prints here, but I think somewhere along here is a prospectus. Is it the next one? No.
It's a
Oh,
their
no,
studios.
this is this. No, what I was going to say was that there was the Studio magazine, which had prospectus and advertising, which showed the Grosvenor School and Heathersley's, and three Australian women came to London,
Yeah.
rather like having a gap year nowadays, to enroll at the Grosvenor School.
Yeah.
So it became quite international. And I suppose how the market developed was through these three women who started showing work in Australia.
Yes.
And then in the early 80s, Sybil being discovered in Canada.
Yes.
And thought of as a Canadian artist.
Well,
and then Mary comes into it.
Of course, I know. It's lovely to see that circle go round. But they were internationally exhibited in the 20s and 30s.
They went as far as Shanghai.
Shanghai and in America and in Cape Town and in Melbourne. So their work was shown across the world.
Some of these, I mean, sorry to interrupt you, the one on the left, which is the tube train, it was, I think, Flight and Power must have decided that this was going to be a seller. And so they actually made 2 editions of it.
Yes.
They made one edition, I think, of 60 for the UK, and then Rex thought this was going to sell very well and made one of an American edition as well.
Yes.
And then when you look at, you know, this is now London life, and they are Londoners for,
yes,
for 10 years,
yes.
something like that.
Yeah.
But they see themselves now as artists, and all sorts of things were happening in London. It was, you know, Wembley Stadium was built in 1923. New buildings were going up.
Yes.
There was this post-war boom, and yet Cyril is attracted by the underground, as we saw from the earlier etching of those curves. Of
yes,
the
that's
railway.
true. That's true. I mean, it partly here you can see that it is the fact of the tunnel, as it were, the straight lines, the curves, everything like that. But also he was very interested as an architect. He was interested in what was being built.
Yeah.
He was interested in new techniques, the escalator, the lift, the use of ferro concrete and things like that. And he was also, you know, that was so much of the moment. The amazing Piccadilly Underground station opened in 1928, just before the exhibition, with this sort of art deco surrounds and the lights. And there and at Tottenham Court Road, where he drew the escalator, there's this sense of, and people felt it, of crowds descending into the underground, and the tube lines had spread further and further out. Yeah. So it's as if people being carried away and carried into work, and you do, as we said with the films earlier and the stories of the time, there's that sense of it being a mechanized world that is both beautiful and slightly inhuman. So that I think that when Cyril is writing back, when he says whence and whither, as you said, on one drawing for that, he'd written, you know, the bottomless pit, as it were, and that people are actually being sucked into the underground. So there's a great ambivalence in his attitude to the city and to the underground, which he depicts so powerfully.
Do you think he was aware of the contemporary films that were on at the time? Do you think he was aware of Fitz Lang and?
I think he was. Like yes, I think he was, and a lot of novelists too actually talk about what it feels like to go, you know, down into the depths and things like that. I think he was. We know he had a friend who was a projectionist at one of the London cinemas and things like that. So he was alert, and he loved the theatre. He loved film.
Yes, they both did. I mean, they spent.
Yeah.
I think I noticed that they didn't have much money, but they certainly got around to a lot of concerts, and they knew a lot of actors.
Yes,
and,
they did. Yes.
Yes, I said, you know, they may have had lack of funds, but they managed to enjoy London life to its fullest, didn't they?
They did. And Cyril was a very talented musician. And he played the violin, he played many stringed instruments, he played the piano and so on. And together they developed a musical interest a little later after these prints. Sybil began playing the recorder, they played together and things like that. But the excitement of the concert was a lot of traditional pieces, but also what we have, the proms, which are still our great summer London concerts began. And they heard very early in the 20s, when you heard works like Stravinsky's Rite of Spring and things like that, that seemed like modern music to them, you know.
They responded to that, did they?
Oh yes, I think they did. Yes, definitely. And to opera too, and that is one wonderful things where Sybil writes in her diary. Sometimes she does just write, you know, concert at the Queen's Hall, great fun, as it were, but clearly
Exciting.
she says wonderful, yes, exciting. And so this is a concerto, quite sort of later in this decade of Cyril's, looking down, and I found it quite sweet. And you know, he's looking at the stringed section, as it were, and this amazingly energetic conductor. But that's not quite so good for a linocut, almost, because it's too detailed, too human, it's too active.
Whereas the one on the right-hand side, Sybil's concert hall.
Sybil's concert hall is superb.
Superb, isn't
And
it?
she
It's
says
just
that,
everything,
yes,
that it's simple,
exactly.
and all the detail taken away.
I know, she said that when you looked up at, this was the Queen's Hall, which was bombed, destroyed during the war. It was the great London concert hall with wonderful acoustics. And anybody looking at that print would recognize it, this particular way that the galleries curved round and the lights go out. It's a very, very clever use of actually quite a geometric technique.
One thing that I haven't certainly thought about was the not the great exhibition, Wembley.
Oh yes.
The world, what was it called?
It was called the Empire Exhibition.
The Empire Exhibition in
1924.
1924 had quite a profound effect on them. They visited several times.
They did. They did. They were intrigued, as many artists were, particularly by African art at the time, and the sort of the carvings, and there were African workmen workshops, creating furniture there, and they brought a door, they brought a table, they brought many things like that. And they don't seem to have had any qualms actually about colonial exploitation. They were just fascinated by the art. I mean, other people who went to this exhibition, which represented all the colonies with sort of, kind of temples for India, big forts for Africa and so on, could see that it was actually exploitative and horrifying, and it was like a sort of trembling under the end of empire. But I think Cyril and Sybil were just absolutely fascinated by the craft.
And they made prints in sets of 13, about a dozen, which they sold to print shops all over the place to live.
Yes, they did. They were craftspeople, really. And at Wembley, it was the craft that excited them. Also the fun fair. There was a fun fair at Wembley, and there's a fun fair at Hampstead Hill. And that too attracted Cyril in particular, both because of the speed, but also the amazing, as it were, abstract patterns that these machines.
We haven't got one
made.
here, but there's a fantastic Appy Hampstead.
Yes.
Where Appy is the Cockney for dropping the H. Happy Hampstead became Happy Hampstead. It's one of the most intricate linocuts that he ever made, I think, because it's an incredible thing.
And people spin just as the, I mean, the constant use here, as you see, of these semicircles and triangles, and really taken to an extreme on a fun fair is that the people spin, as it were, this great centrifugal centripetal force.
Also at Wembley, sport, of course, is a very much associated with their work, and the linocut really lent itself to the medium to show the speed and the dynamism of sport as we see it in the posters that were produced in 1933. But sport was, I mean, it's perfect for the linocut, and but it wasn't, a tennis match wasn't something that etchers did. They did horses and things like that, because that was a very highbrow a sport,
Yeah.
the sport of kings, I suppose.
That's a very
raising.
good point. Yes, I've never seen an
it-
etching of a tennis
No,
one.
no have I. But they looked at sport and they used this new medium
Yes.
to depict it in the most incredible way. I mean, on the right there is Jean Barotra, the French
Yeah.
bounding
Yeah,
Basque, as he
yeah.
was known, and football or soccer, as it's known in America, on the left-hand side.
Yes.
In the
Yeah.
days when there was contact, but nowadays it's not
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
But
It's a very interesting contrast, that too, if you think of the ones we showed at the beginning, the bringing in the boat and the eight, in that Cyril Power tends to be more romantic, more lyrical, more fluid, more organic. And it's Sybil, who is, some people have looked at these and using old stereotypes, which we don't, said, oh, well, I said, you know, it's a man and a woman. They said, oh yeah, that's a man, you know, the football and the tennis must be the woman because it's so flown. And of course it's not at all, but also the way that they work together is interesting, in that if Sybil is interested in something that Cyril is doing, she recreates it in her own inimitable style.
and this happened
vice
very
versa.
much on the subject of sport in the posters that
Yes,
they
it
did
did.
for
Yeah.
the sort of design guru of the London Underground, who was a man called Frank Pick.
Oh, wonderful, Frank Pick. Yes.
And they
yeah.
did eight posters, I think.
Yes.
Do we have the next one? Any of the posters? Yeah, here they are. So we have the Epsom Racecourse on the left,
Yes.
and Wimbledon on the right. And these were produced to advertise the various stops that could be reached via the London Underground and Green Line bus or whatever it happened to be. I mean, Epsom, you'd have to go to Morden Station. I think it says so on there.
Yes.
And you have to get a bus.
Get a
from there-
bus. Yeah.
from there, and this is the last bend coming round. But these were, before them, it was Magnite Kofer who was producing the most
Yes.
avant-garde posters until these came along.
Yes, they did. And you can see with the tennis how she reflects that fluidity of Cyril's linocut of tennis. But the Epsom is pure Sybil because of this wonderful speed and the reduction of everything. And there's humor too, all the crowds lining up. And then you see the little red buses or green buses that you're supposed to get sort of sitting in the corner.
And in those days, they were open-topped as well, so you could see the race from the top of the bus.
Yeah, you could.
What have we got next? I think
Oh, couldn't be more different.
it couldn't be more different, but I thought I'd sort of bring this in because Sybil turned towards Christian Science in her life, didn't
Yes,
she?
she did.
When I first saw these, I thought, oh, she must have been a very staunch Catholic, but it was Cyril who was the staunch Catholic.
Well,
Going back
I know.
to Margaret Roper.
Yes. Cyril's wife's family were descended from Margaret Roper, who was the daughter of Thomas More, who was executed by Henry VIII, and who was a staunch Catholic. And he was he converted to Catholicism. But he maybe it's a delicacy about your own faith. He never produced any overtly religious prints. He did a print of Thomas Aquinas and a print of the murder of Thomas Becket.
And St. Francis.
Yes, St. Francis. St. Francis. So it's sort of saints, but Sybil homes straight in on the Passion, and she actually worked on this. You see, this is a later print, but she producing prints of the Passion, beginning with Golgotha in 1931, all the way through her life. And as Mary Ryan said when talking about her yesterday, she was very definite that it was the drama that attracted her, a sort of quintessential drama of the Passion, not any religious belief, which is hard to accept because they're such powerful prints. But on the other hand, as a Christian Scientist, several women artists at that time actually were Christian Scientists. Winifred Nicholson is one, others, because it went with a sense that they were partly it was it had been founded by a woman, as it were, Mary Baker Eddy, so it was a kind of woman thing. But it's the sense that they're looking for something, the essence, as they called it, that beneath the illusion, that reality is an illusion, and somehow you find a deeper thing. It's quite hard to make that fit with a lot of Sybil's art, actually, but she certainly held to that belief. And as was said yesterday, it was very much a social thing for her. Once she was in Canada, that she read the Monitor, she kept in touch through that way. But her religious art, and you think there is the great, if controversial or difficult religious artists working at the time, one of whom is Eric Gill, whose Stations of the Cross were in Westminster Cathedral. And you see how this is profoundly modern at the same time as being ancient in spirit.
I always thought that she was interested in, you know, man and laboring. And to me, that it was always the ultimate labor of man, of Christ carrying the cross.
That's very good.
I wonder whether she...
I think that probably is it. Yes, I think that is it. I think, and I think too, when she began it, there's a great sense of national grief, which only comes out in novels and poems and things 10 years after the end of the First World War. So 1929, it's odd, there are a lot of novels and memoirs suddenly become published about the war. And there's something in these prints too, which is about, as it were, the loss of the young, you know, the power, and about grieving, really. But it's quite true. Again, it's leverage, it's power, it's strength, and it's strength under the most intense possible pressure.
Yeah. So what's the next slide, boys? So we're still in London at the moment, and the print on the left had a great deal of effect on me, because this was the one that I found in the drawer at the Redfern.
Oh.
Probably one that Rex didn't pay for. But here's Cyril on the right-hand side, an invigilator at an exam.
Yes.
So he was he an RIB, Royal Institute of British Architects invigilator?
Yes, he was.
But it's very surreal with those lamps looking down on these poor students that are having to sit through this whole process.
Yes, they're like eyes. Cyril is trying to do something different here, a bit as we saw with the concerto, which is to somehow fuse lino cutting with realism. I mean, it is surreal in its arrangement, but it's also, as it were, real. Like he wants to show you in this exaggerated sort of expressionist almost way the different commuters on the tube, all buried in their newspapers, and also the all the people in the exam room who actually, although they're all sitting in rows, if you look closely and carefully, they're all completely different. Some are hunched up, some are sort of sprawling, some are bored stiff, some are finished. And so he really tries to make a sort of intricate thing out of the lino cut. And I think that perhaps that wasn't possible for him.
Sorry, my computer seems to have gone off here, so we'll have to look over. We can look over that. And the tube train is quite sort of Berlin-like, early 1930s.
Absolutely, but also it makes you think there's something about George Gross about it.
That's what made me.
Yes, it is. They look sort of peaky. There's a haunting woman's face just with her touch of rouge looking at you, and everybody else is buried under it.
It's quite sort of English reticence or British reticence to converse with one another on the train.
Of course, we wouldn't dream of it.
I was saying on the talk I gave on Monday, with all those newspapers there, you can substitute them for a mobile phone
yes,
today.
we'd all be looking at our phone. Exactly. But the thing, yes, they probably will. In a way, seeing them now, although that is the tube train, it's the people in the train, and that sense of the peril of the tunnels has transmuted into the stress of being in a crowd in the city, yeah, being under intense pressure somehow. The lights are too hot, you know, they're all too close together. There's a sense of wanting to get away. In the poor exam room, you know, they beam down upon it. It's very claustrophobic.
A bit like now.
Yes, well.
COVID days. So I've written down here that, you know, as you write, as the war approaches through the 30s, speed was losing its allure. They felt a need to slow down, to turn their backs on the city and to retreat to the country.
They did.
And that's when she bought Woolpit for 200 or Tyrrell.
Yes, she did buy it. Yes, she did. She did buy it. Yes, it's funny like that. Yes, in a village just outside Bury St Edmunds, her mother Beatrice had bought an ancient cottage, a sort of 2 down, 1 up, really, with beams and gables and things in this little village called Woolpit. And Sybil was the one who was fascinated by the history of the place and things like that. Though she's so modern, a machine age person, she's in love with the local history. And so Beatrice said in her will, if Sybil wanted to buy it for £250, she should, and that her brothers and sisters agreed. So she did, and they would retreat to the country, and that was quite different. But that also is very much in tune with the mood of the times. And you think of Paul Nash or John Nash, the megaliths, and you think of the shell guides, and I don't know, you know, the sort of many of the photographs, and indeed some of the tube posters are about getting out, and it's about a peculiar form of Englishness, I think, that
I think
they
there was
wanted to
a new
resurrect.
leisure, a new class. I mean, there was money was more plentiful.
Well,
but it was still in the Depression years.
Yes, the Depression. I think that they're evading the Depression in a way. And I don't think it's to do with money. Many of the artists who go to the country, whether they go to Suffolk or to Norfolk or to, you know, St Ives or things like that, that it's not that. They feel they're out of touch with some element of some spirit of the place, really, is the Nash move, isn't it?
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely. Spirit of place, yes.
The sort of the tumuli, the ancient burials, the copses, the woods, the coast, the sea. You know, there's a and it goes with other things that they were interested in, which don't seem at all related to modernist prints, which is things like medieval music and Morris dancing.
That surprised me, actually, the interest in medieval music. But I suppose that relates to Cyril's interest in church architecture. Yes,
well, they have this double. They really have a double interest, and I think that is in common with a lot of artists of the day. There's a great the need to represent the city, to find something that represents the modern mood, but also a longing for something perhaps more ancient, more lyrical.
Do you think this is a British desire for the pastoral?
Yes, completely.
Going back to Samuel Palmer and Romanticism.
Yes, completely, exactly that. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So what have we got next, boys? So we were talking about her desire, and Suffolk has never left her.
No.
Even when they go to Canada, which we'll come on to in a moment.
Yeah.
That it's the Suffolk landscape that still rules her.
Yes, yes.
So inbred in her, isn't it?
It is. And she said, you know, that again, you could see this is the rhythm of labor, but also the rhythm of nature, the way the field, the ridges, the fields, I think these are the people scything and the hazel, cutting the hay. And she wrote about this in letters later, and she said the amazing thing about scything, it's like ballet, and you think of her pictures of racehorses too, in the team, and you think of the sledgehammers or anything, interesting people working in teams.
This rhythm.
The rhythm, the team have to follow each other, because if they're out of sync, they're going to cut each other's
Yeah.
legs
Yeah.
off. They're going whoa, down and down, and she caught that. And the other was that she loved, as she said, in their summers in Woolpit, she would stand at the corner of the field and watch the teams of these great Suffolk Shire horses.
Which we see on the right hand side.
Yes, indeed, ploughing
Yeah.
the field and back and forth. And she said they would be astonished that she was there. They came to the corner of the field, there she was again. But in this one, which is called Day's End, the team are coming home exhausted, tired, and the ploughboy on the back who's been out there for hours. It's a very moving, very sort of elegiac portrait of rural life, because a lot was disappearing of this traditional way of life. So to capture it in the most modern of mediums is a fantastic.
It is a fantastic thing,
Yeah.
isn't it? So one of the things that surprised me was that here the Second World War is approaching. They've witnessed the First World War, you know, the most incredible things that happened. I mean, such a ghastly war. And then the rise of Nazism in 1933, and they seem to be totally apolitical. I mean, there's nothing that I've read where they've commented on this terrible rise of fascism or the, you know, the brown shirts, Mosley. Nothing is mentioned at all.
No, it isn't. And they had friends who were you know, Jewish emigres who had to come to Britain to escape, but they rather, and it is a sort of blinker. I mean, rather like the Wembley exhibition, they are interested in them, and they say what a fantastic story, or how awful for you, or how terrible this is. But they're interested in the art. They keep their focus close, and then they do move away. And no, so, you know, even demonstrations in London and things they choose not to mention. I don't actually have letters from Cyril or things like that to know precisely. But I think they are apolitical in a way.
So then the war begins, and the relationship starts to not break down, but she goes off. She goes off.
Well, she'd gone before that. I think in the late 30s, 38, Sybil wants to leave London, and she said the newspapers are full of war. She wants to go. And it's that desire to go back to the country. So her brother had always camped in the New Forest in the south of England, near the coast, and that's where she wants to go. And Cyril, in his architect hat and partner hat, to designed that she bought a little house in an auction, a tiny thatched cottage, and called it Pipers after their piping. And Cyril designed an annex, which was in fact a much bigger house attached to the tiny cottage, which became their studio. And that's where Sybil moved to, and he stayed in London working. He came down
occasionally weekends,
all the weekends, all the holidays, etc. But I think it was a move away, and probably she, you know, again that there are no letters. They're certainly very close, doing the house, doing Pipers until the start of war, and then when she goes to work in a boatyard on the Solent, Southampton, we're building fast boats for the Navy. Where she met the Walter Morgan, who was also working there, who was a great character and nearer her age. I mean, by that time, Cyril is 70, you know, she's 45.
So she marries Walter.
Yes.
In 1946 or thereabouts.
Yeah.
And then they go off to Canada.
They do.
Not quite following in the footsteps of her father, who had left the family and gone to Canada in the late teens. And they settle on Vancouver Island at Campbell River.
Yes.
And she carries on making her prints, and she starts a school there. But I'm hurrying a little bit because I have a feeling that we may be over the time limit. But let's see. So she misses the Suffolk landscape, and she's still making prints like the wonderful coffee bar and the lumberjacks, and it's still the labors of man that
Yes,
she,
but it's now very, very Canadian.
very Canadian, as you can see by the plaid shirt.
Yeah.
So we might have to wind it up there. But I mean, we could go on for another hour and a half, 2 hours.
Afraid so.
But in Canada, I think in 1947, she's first, 48, I think that her work is recognized. And then we go up to about 1982, when Peter White puts together the first catalogue raisonné of her work at the Glenbow Museum. And then Mary Bryan goes there, Michael Parkin goes there, and the whole thing explodes. I find some prints in the Redfern drawers, one of which is the tube train. And then I meet Kit Power, Edmund, the youngest son. And so I'm showing these at the London Original Print Fair. Mary's showing them in New York. And then now we end up with this wonderful exhibition, which is opening tomorrow at the Metropolitan
it's so
Museum.
exciting. Yes.
Exciting. I wish we could go, but we can't because we're not allowed into America until after the 8th of November. So I did think about actually getting a 9:30 flight tomorrow morning and arriving there
for the opening.
but it can't. So I think we might have to wind it up there because we're well over the 1 hour. So should we hand back to New York?
Yes, thanks very much. That was a fantastic conversation. I know we all learned so much and highly, highly interesting. And so we'll expect you on an airplane, both of you on November 8th, right? We'll hope so. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And tune in again tomorrow. We've got another 1 or 2 of these print month presentations. Goodbye, everybody.
Do we have any Q&As? We haven't got time.
Oh, well, if anybody wants to stay on, there were some questions that came in. I don't know if the people are still on. We've lost part of our audience, of course. But one person asked, they said they're curious about the level of success the artists had with their prints in terms of exhibitions and public exposure. Somebody else said Cyril left behind a wife and family of 4. What did they all live on? Was there money there? Did Cyril make such a living? Parentheses, sorry for the American question. And somebody else said that was fascinating. What an education. Many thanks. And I think you can answer those offline, Jenny and Gordon. Will send them to you with the people's names. And,
okay.
With that, thank you so much for this, and thank you, Jennifer Farrell, so much. Bye.
A pleasure. Bye now.